Good morning, Trinity Episcopal Church. Good to be with you this morning. My name is Rick Stravers, and if you're a visitor here, maybe I should just say I'm a visitor too. So welcome. So here we are, a beautiful summer morning in a beautiful church, stunning windows, listening to beautiful music, and listening to some of the thoughts and discoveries of our ancestors in faith. Praying together in a few moments. We'll pray some concerns together. We'll celebrate our communion with God, and we'll support each other as we're doing all this. What a good thing to do on a summer morning. I'd like to just take a minute before I explore one of our passages with you to invite you to join me in helping ourselves arrive here this morning by just taking a couple slow breaths together. How about if we take an in breath and hold it for just a second, and then an out breath together. Let's do a couple of those. So let's breathe in, pause, and breathe out. Let's breathe in, pause, and breathe out. Thank you. We can welcome ourselves home this morning, home to the love of God, home to this, our place in this planet Earth, in this vast universe. I hope our time this morning can be an opportunity to explore some inner resources for our lives. It's possible to discover resources within ourselves that will help us live in our time, this time, with love, with joy, and with peace. I say that partly as an expression of my hope that it's possible, and as trusting in the scriptures, which say it's possible. I learned that yesterday, I think it was yesterday or Friday, was the anniversary of the publishing of the Diary of Anne Frank, 75 years ago, 1947. And in that diary, Anne Frank wrote, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single minute before starting to improve the world." I love her fresh spirit. She was something else. What a beautiful thing. Nobody need wait a single minute before starting to improve the world. Or, I want to add, before starting to embrace ourselves and our lives and this world. We don't need to wait a single minute. We don't need to wait before we start to turn to the Spirit of God within us, the Spirit of God within our world. We can do it now. In our second lesson today, which is where I was drawn among our lessons this morning, St. Paul says, the last sentence of the lesson, if we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. It's an interesting sentence, an idea. What could it mean? We live by the Spirit, by the life of God within us, Paul says. Since that's how it is, let's allow that Spirit to guide how we live. So I'm wondering if he thinks that when we center our hearts and minds and bodies in this awareness of the Spirit, we discover an inner space inside of us, an inner life, we call it. And when we ground ourselves a bit in that spirit within us, we can find treasure there. So in a way, Paul's giving us a little treasure map. Between the 8 o'clock and the 10 o'clock, I used my phone map, the map on my phone, as we do nowadays, to find the nearest Starbucks. So I just let it tell me where to go, right? Well, we can't, that doesn't work for this. But St. Paul says he's telling us that the Spirit is within us and we can find gifts for our life there. And I think that's one of the great mysteries of life. That our inner life arises from the Spirit of God. And if that's the case, if we reject that inner life, Paul says, so he does that side too. If we reject that inner life and refuse the gifts of that Spirit within us, then we may find ourselves anchoring our lives in things like envy or anger or fear. And we know nobody does that nowadays. There's no anger or fear in our world, right? Anyway, we could anchor ourselves there, but Paul also says, no, we could anchor ourselves in the Spirit of God within us and find resources there for joy and for love and for courage. Now, if that's true, that seems really important to me. And as I reflected on how important that feels to me, I thought next, but is it reality? Or is it just silly talk? When I wrote that sentence, I remembered where it came from. I used to read with my daughters a lot when they were young. One of the books we read often together was a book called And Rain Makes Applesauce. Anybody here know that book? Wonderful, wonderful book. It's decades old now, as they are. My kids, I mean. So in that book, there was a repeated refrain that we just loved saying as we read it together. Oh, you're just talking silly talk. It was fun to read it, fun to say it. Well, when Anne Frank says, isn't it wonderful that nobody need wait even a single minute before starting to improve the world, is she just talking silly talk? And when St. Paul says, since we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit, because there's resources there. Is he just talking silly talk? Well, we can't help but wonder if it's silly talk, I guess. But I don't think so. And we don't need really to take Paul's word for it so much as to follow his cue, his clue and invitation. We can explore this for ourselves and see what we discover. We can explore to see if you and I have within us the Spirit or life of God, and if that makes resources for life available to us. We can explore it. We have an interior, a spiritual interior. It's not a place we can photograph or pinpoint, but we all have an interior, an inner room, we could say, a heart of hearts, we call it sometimes. And it's a space within us that makes us, in some way, kind of like a tent for the Spirit of God. Or like a sail that catches the breeze of the Spirit of God. Or like an altar. Or like a temple. The key thing about a temple is not the outer walls, although it's often beautiful and we take photographs of the outer walls. But the key thing about a temple is that inner space, right? The mystery within the temple. From one perspective, a temple is simply empty, space, spaciousness. But in this space is where the treasure dwells. In our baptismal vows, we always say that we will seek and serve Christ in all persons. When we say that, we're referring to this inner mystery within each person. We say in our baptismal vows that we will respect the dignity of every human being. This too is referring to this inner mystery. And I think it's important to recognize that this applies to us too, because unless we recognize that, it's hard to recognize it in other people. We seek and serve Christ not only in other people, but also within the mystery of our own selves. We respect the dignity of Christ, not only in other people, but also in our own being. So the path for seeking and serving Christ in other people goes through seeking and serving Christ in ourselves. The path to respecting the dignity of other people goes through learning to respect the dignity of Christ in our own selves. And we practice anchoring our awareness in this reality in our prayer and meditation. That's part of what we're here for today. And that's a good, needed practice. So Paul says, God's Spirit abides in us, and it's like a fruit tree. But it's a weird kind of fruit tree because it bears all kinds of fruit. It's like a tree that bears apples, pears, peaches, plums, oranges. It's an unusual kind of tree. The tree within us flowers into a variety of kinds of fruits: love, joy, and peace, he says. Patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and wise action. Self-control, he calls it. I'm calling it wise responses. I wonder if we can experience these wonderful expressions of the Spirit just as Paul did. But then right away, when I hear that list, I turn it into a guilt thing. I think I have to force myself to be loving and joyful and kind and gentle, right? But I don't think you do. I don't think we get those gifts by trying to force them. I don't think we get them by nagging ourselves or judging ourselves and making ourselves feel guilty. I think the thing to do to discover the expressions of the Spirit within us is to turn toward that Spirit and be attentive. Turn toward that empty space where the Spirit of God lives within us. And in this turning, seek to discover the flowering of love, the brightness of joy, the fragrance of peace, and the other good gifts that come from the Spirit. We can't force them or coerce them, but we can, St. Paul says, discover them. So turning to the life of God within us, we may find these gifts appearing sometimes, gently, subtly maybe. Our inner being is a temple for the Spirit of God. And this is your human dignity and my human dignity. And when we respect this dignity within ourselves, we might find these subtle and beautiful treasures awaiting us and ready to nourish us as resources for our life. Since we are alive with the Spirit of God, as Paul says, What if we just remained aware and alert to discover within ourselves expressions of this very Spirit? What is it like to open our hearts to that? What is it like to open ourselves to fruits like that, flowers like that? What is it like to seek within ourselves resources for the gifts of love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and so forth? And if those are present within us somehow by the gift of God's grace, why would we not want to explore it and find out? That's the question I found in today's lesson from St. Paul that I'm eager to share with you, and I'm eager to explore in the future myself. I invite you to consider exploring it too. Amen.